Students frequently come into my undergraduate sociology of gender class not believing that the kinds of biases that I talk about still exist and will still affect them in the workplace today. But interestingly, several years down the road, when they're actually out in the workplace, I frequently get emails back from them where they're describing the kinds of biases they are experiencing and very much show that these biases do still affect young women today at work. If we're going to craft solutions that actually level the playing field, it's first important to understand how stereotypes produce the disadvantaging effects that they do. So let's start with a research study that you may have heard about. It got quite a lot of press. In the 70s and 80s, women made up only 5% of all the orchestra musicians around the country. And so orchestras became concerned that perhaps a bias against women in the auditioning process was contributing to this dearth of women. So what they decided to do was to make a seemingly minor change. They introduced a blind audition process whereby they put a screen between the musician who was auditioning and the audience, the judges who were evaluating that musician. This small change increased the odds that a woman would make it past the preliminary round of auditions by a full 50%. Today, women make up 25% of all orchestra musicians, so we're not at parity yet, but research shows that the introduction of that screen was a contributing factor in really increasing the number of women in orchestras. I like this study because I think it illustrates two main points. One is that gender stereotypes bias the evaluations of individuals, and they do so in ways that we might call male advantaging. Gender stereotypes lead men to be evaluated more positively than they would be if we didn't know their gender, whereas women tend to be evaluated more negatively than they would be if we did not know their gender. The introduction of this screen removed this male advantaging bias. Which leads to my second point, and this is a very important one. These biases are not inevitable. Okay? There are things we can do to prevent them. In the case of the orchestra, they introduced the screen, and that took away the bias. So most of us, of course, would not want to or could not perform our work behind a screen. So we're going to actually have to be more creative than that. Before moving on, I'd like to say just a little bit about the word bias itself. A lot of people don't like this word. They think it has kind of an ugly connotation to it. It sounds like we're accusing someone of being sort of sexist or racist or something like that. But that's not how I'm using the term here, and it's not how it's commonly used in social psychology. When I talk about bias, I'm simply talking about an error in decision making. So in the case of the orchestras, we can probably assume that the judges wanted to hire the best musician possible. But yet, gender affected how they saw the quality of men and women's performances. An important point is that all of us, men and women, are prone to these sorts of biases. But the good news is, with proper procedures in place and with appropriate effort, we can reduce and even eliminate these biases. So gender stereotypes function as a cognitive shortcut in information processing. So if you're in a situation where you have a lot of information that you have to evaluate, it's natural to look for shortcuts to take in navigating all that information. Unfortunately, gender stereotypes function as one of these shortcuts, and when they do so, they introduce error into our decision making. Well, it turns out that one such shortcut that people take is to rely, often unconsciously or implicitly, on what they think they know about categories of people, like men and women. So the question is then, what do we think we know about categories of men and women? Another way of asking that question is to say, what is the content of our gender stereotypes? Research on this continues to find that people hold stereotypes such as the following. They believe that men are slightly more capable at most tasks than are women. Not a whole lot, just slightly, but this is enough to affect our judgments. When it comes to tasks in the sort of traditional male-type domains, things like tasks that require mechanical ability or mathematical ability or leadership, okay, the gap is stronger. People have stronger beliefs that men are better than women in these domains. Women, by contrast, they're thought to be better at typical feminine tasks, things that require nurturing ability and caretaking and the like. Unfortunately, though, those tasks themselves tend to be devalued in the workplace. Further, people expect that women should be warm and nice and kind and not dominant and assertive. whereas men are expected to be action-oriented and assertive, but certainly not modest and weak. The question now is, what's the effect of those stereotypes on our decision-making, on how we evaluate and interact with men and women? One consequence is that stereotypes cause us to use a different standard depending on whether we're evaluating a man or a woman. So our standards shift around depending on the gender of the person that we're evaluating. So why would this be? Well, when a woman performs well, and especially if it's one of those traditional male-type tasks, this performance runs counter to what our stereotypic expectations would have led us to expect. So as a result, we tend to really scrutinize her performance as if we're trying to understand how it is that she could have performed so well. When a man performs equally as well, this, by contrast, is consistent with what our stereotypes would have led us to expect. So we don't scrutinize his performance as carefully. What this means then is that the man ends up being judged by a more lenient standard than the woman. It's as if the bar is higher for women than it is for men. Our goal today, I think, is to think about how we might equalize those bars such that men and women are judged by the same standard. So I want to share a research study with you that really illustrates this point. And what they did in the experiment is they had psychology faculty all over the country evaluate a candidate for an assistant professor position in their department. Now, unbeknownst to the evaluators, this candidate was a fictitious candidate, was created for the purpose of the study. And so they created a resume for this candidate, and the person had just gotten his or her PhD. They sent the resumes out to faculty all over the country with one key difference. Half the people in the study got the resume with a woman's name on it, and the other half got the very same resume. Everything was the same, except that it had a man's name on it. So this study then lets us see whether gender affects how these psychology candidates were rated. The difference in the study was striking. 79% of the applicants that had a man's name on it were deemed worthy of hire. 79%. But only 49% of the resumes, the very same resume with a woman's name on it, were deemed as worthy of hire. Further, in a second part of the study, the authors discovered that people wrote 4 times more what they called doubt-raising statements on the rating forms for the female applicants compared to the male applicants. They wrote things like, "I would need to see evidence that she'd gotten these grants and publications on her own." That concern was raised 4 times more frequently for women applicants than for men applicants. I'd now like to talk about a second way that stereotypes affect men and women's career experiences. And what we're going to see here is that stereotypes actually shift the very criteria that we use to judge men and women. So again, I'll share another research study from the field of psychology with you. And in this study, what people were doing was evaluating individuals for a position as a police chief. And as you probably know, police chief is a very male-dominated type of job, okay? And so everybody that was doing the evaluation got 2 resumes to look at for 2 different candidates, and the resumes were constructed to be as equivalent as possible, except that one of the 2 applicants had more education, more relevant education to being a police chief, and the other applicant had more experience. They had people evaluate them, and in the first condition of the experiment, one group of participants rated the 2 applicants with no names on the files. Okay, so there was no way to know who was a man or who was a woman. What happened in that condition of the experiment is the participants overwhelmingly favored the person who had more education. And they justified their choice by saying, education's what really matters to me. Second phase of the study, what happens is they put names on each of the 2 resumes, okay? And they put the man's name on the one with more education, and they put a woman's name on the one that has more experience. And what they find here is, just like in the first part, people preferred the person with more education. It happened to be the man, okay? So they chose the man, and they justified the choice by saying he had more education. Now they put the woman's name on the application, on the resume for the person who has more education, and the man's name on the one that has more experience, okay? We've been preferring people all along who had more education. Are we now going to prefer the woman? She has more education. And as you could probably guess by now, that's not what happened. The participants overwhelmingly preferred the man, and when they justified their choice, they said it was because he had more experience. So we see the way that our stereotypes led to a shifting of the very criteria that was deemed important in order to justify what would have been the more stereotypic hiring decision. women are often aware that they face a higher hurdle. And so what we often do then is just, say, we're going to work harder and get over that higher hurdle. But that doesn't even always work. Sometimes in our effort to really display and make clear our competence, we actually elicit negative reactions in terms of how likable we are. So people don't like us. That's what we call a backlash reaction, or the classic double bind that women face. It's hard to be seen simultaneously as competent and likable. Research finds that stereotypes do tend to matter still once people are on the job. And I'll just share quickly with you two ways that they matter. One is that women are less likely to have influence in work groups than men are. What I mean by that is that when a woman makes a suggestion in a group, people are less likely to take up that suggestion and use it. Okay? Whereas men's suggestions are more likely to be taken up. And this occurs even when women are defined as the expert in the group. Okay? So they have less influence. The second thing is that women tend to be less likely to get credit for their ideas. And this is something when I talk with groups around the country about, people report having happened to them quite a bit. And I don't know if it's happened to you, but it's a situation where, let's say you're in a group and you make a suggestion, and then it's just like silence. It's as if you said nothing. No one hears you. The meeting just moves on as if you had never spoken. And then a few minutes later, someone else in the room says the very same thing. And people are like, oh, Bob, great, that was a fabulous suggestion. So women are less likely to get credit for their ideas. I like to differentiate between what we might call individual survival strategies and organizational solutions. Individual survival strategies are the things that individual women do at work to work around the biases that they might encounter, so being self-promoting or things like that. Organizational solutions, by contrast, are things that the organization does to change the environment to lessen the incidence of bias in the first place. And I'm going to share 6 different concrete solutions with you. But there's one underlying principle that unites all of them, and that is this: our solutions must break the tendency to use stereotypes as a cognitive shortcut. One way that we can do this is to educate people about how stereotypes work. The kind of training session like you've been listening to here, for example, when people have heard this information and understand how stereotypes work, they tend to scrutinize their own decision-making more carefully, and that breaks the tendency to use stereotypes as a shortcut. When I go out and talk to people about reducing bias like this, often they'll say to me, well, you're preaching to the choir. I mean, we're people who are already concerned about these sorts of things, or we wouldn't have come to this session. And what I like to say to them is, no, actually what I'm doing is arming the choir. I'm giving well-intentioned people like you all tools that can help you be able to act in your workplace in a way that will reduce the biases that otherwise might occur. The second solution that I'd like to offer is that when we're making hiring or promotion decisions, or even when we're deciding who to put on our teams, that we first establish very clear criteria and qualifications for our decisions. If we return to that police chief study here for just a moment, it's a great example of this. They did one more condition of this experiment, where they had the people who were evaluating the police chief say what criteria was important to them before they looked at any applicants. And people overwhelmingly said, education's what's important to me. Having said that, when they came across a woman with more education, they chose her for the police chief position. Lots of research shows this. The more formal the criteria there are, the more women and the more underrepresented minorities will be hired. So it's a solution that has a lot of research-based evidence. So the third solution that I would offer is to really scrutinize the criteria you're using when making hiring and promotion decisions. Are they the right criteria? Do they predict success on the job? Are the criteria filtering out a disproportionate number of women? If so, it's really important to understand if the criteria really matter in terms of who's going to be successful eventually on the job. And I want to share with you a study here that I think is really a very encouraging example of how this can work. And it comes from Carnegie Mellon University. And Carnegie Mellon increased the representation of women in its computer science undergraduate major from 7% to 42%. From 7% to 42% in just 5 years. Now, they did lots of things, as you might imagine, to bring about such a drastic change. But one of the things that they did is they removed the requirement that they had prior that someone had to have high levels of computing experience before they could be admitted to the major. They just took that criteria away. They noticed that men were more likely to show up at the university, for whatever reason, with more computer experience than women. And so this was filtering out large numbers of women. And so they asked themselves, they said, we're a university. Perhaps we could teach people the computer skills that we want them to know instead of hoping that they show up with them. And so this change made a lot more women eligible for this major. And it turns out it did not affect the quality of computer scientists they produced 4 years later either. So it was this kind of irrelevant criteria that had been screening out women. So I think it's important, and we can all do this in our workplace, to think about the criteria we're using and really interrogate whether those criteria are the right criteria, whether they're necessary. The fourth suggestion that I'll offer to you is that we need to hold decision makers, including ourselves, accountable for the decisions that we make. Research is clear on this point. When you have to explain your decision to someone else, that's what accountability means. When I have to explain why I preferred Bob over Sally, for example, I more carefully scrutinize my own decision making. I don't just go with my hunches. I have to tell you what I cared about and what I did. And in the process of deliberating and thinking through the decision process more carefully, we break the tendency to use stereotypes as a shortcut. The fifth solution that I will offer to you is that we should be transparent about what we're doing in terms of who we're hiring and promoting. People manage what they measure. To post the numbers and to keep track of our progress in terms of how we're doing in terms of gender diversity in our workplaces really does cause people to be more thoughtful about how they're making decisions. So the final solution that I want to share with you today is one that I'm really eager to tell you about, because I think it's one that all of us, whether we're in leadership positions or not, could use, and we could use it immediately when we go back to the workplace today. And that is this: to vouch for the competence of women leaders in your organization. What do I mean by that? Whenever you have a chance to introduce someone or talk about someone that you're working with, if you describe her accomplishments or talk about how successful you think she's been, that's vouching for her competence. And that can help overcome the problem that stereotypes often create, and that is that we have doubts about women's competence. Okay? So this is a very easy thing to be able to do. So one study shows kind of how this works, and what happened in this study is that a professor was introducing a female graduate student who was going to be a leader over an undergraduate team. And part of the time he would introduce her and vouch for her competence. He would talk about her research, the publications she had, and the like. And the other times he introduced her just saying her name. Here's Sally, she's going to be your leader. And what he found is that the undergraduate students rated her significantly more highly when the professor had first vouched for her competence. It took away the doubts the students might have about whether she was really successful or competent enough to be their leader. Let's wrap things up. Our goal here, as I said at the onset, was to think about what each of us could do to create workplaces where all people, men and women, could thrive. One problem in achieving this goal is that stereotypes interfere with our decision-making and undermine our evaluations of women. Now, in any one instance, the effects of these stereotypes can be actually quite small. I mean, if you don't get credit for your ideas one day in a meeting, that's not disastrous. But the problem is the effects of stereotypes accumulate over women's careers, a little bit here, a little bit there, adding up in such a way that they serve to carry men and women in actually quite different directions in the workplace. By removing the error in decision-making that stereotypes produce, organizations will be able to more fully harness the full range of talent, all of the talent, men and women, in today's workforce. While it's essential that organizations be involved in these solutions, there are nonetheless things that each of us as individuals can do and that we could do tomorrow to make a difference. For example, tomorrow we could all go out and endorse a woman in our organization, pointing out her competence and her skill when given the chance.